and welcome to the second episode of Dreamers and Doers, where I interview, who, at least according to me, the people who shape the world of tomorrow. And today I'm very excited because my guest is Gaspard Koenig. So I first saw you on TV 4 years ago, read a few of your books, and you're probably the most famous, how would you describe yourself, like libertarian philosopher?
Yeah, I'm on the verge of libertarianism, but not quite there yet. So I started with classical liberalism, which is something that actually the French have invented within the course of the 18th century and developed since then. And I'm getting closer and closer to the libertarians. If we refine, I could probably say I'm a left libertarian. Okay. So the main difference is, what really characterizes the libertarians is the idea of self-ownership. So you start with the idea that you own yourself, also in legal terms, that you have ownership rights on your own bodies, on your own data, on everything that you emit to the world. And this has been first described by Locke in the Second Treaty of Civil Covenant, this idea that I own myself. And it really departed from the Christian tradition, that God owned your own body and that your own body was a reflection of God and of the soul. So in order to secularize, in a way, the social contract and philosophy, I think we have very little choice but ending up with this idea of self-ownership, and it's very powerful, and it's been so reinvigorated by Nozick in the 70s. Now, the question is, the world that is outside us, how do we own it? And there is a nuance. The right libertarians would say, well, this world, these natural resources, if you want, are unowned. So when you appropriate it, when you put your effort into the world, then everything you take from it is yours. And from that point of view, any tax is viewed as a forced labor. Whereas the left libertarians would say, well, those external resources are commonly owned. It's not that they are not owned, but they are owned by everybody, by humanity. So when you transform it, when you appropriate it and you transform it, the work you put in it is yours. And the product of that work and the value you produce through your work is yours, no question. But you have to compensate the rest of the community for the material that you have taken out. And that justifies a number of public policy measures, including, in my view, the basic income. And that's what the argument that Thomas Paine, at the end of the 18th century, already made for the basic income. Meaning you need to compensate the rest of the community for the loss of the natural equality. Right? And I think it's quite powerful. And you know, this idea that, yes, we have to determine our own values. So nobody, and I don't think that society should be based on a set or a framework of common values or common ideals. That it's the role of the civil society to build up that common morality as it goes. But at the same time, I think that the society or the government is legitimate in a certain number of functions, including to give yourself the means of your own liberty, the means of your autonomy.
Do you think, for example, basic income should be part of a government measure?
Absolutely, and I think it's not because it's the end of work. It's more fundamental. It's because in order to ensure that freedom has some reality, that it's not only an abstraction, that it's not only described negatively, but it's also something that can be actually enacted. And you have to make sure that people also have the tools and the means in terms of education, for instance, but also in terms of material resources to activate their own values. And I think that's what some call the real libertarian argument, or the real libertarian argument from Plan Paris in favor of basic income. To me, it's the most powerful one.
Okay. And tell me if I'm wrong, but to me, the kind of pure libertarian idea on this would be like, I live in a society with basic income if I want to, but if I don't want to, I can live in another society.
I'm fine with that, because we can, I'm fine with that. If you take the Nozick's idea, for instance, of an utopia of utopias, it's the idea that the world could be organized in a number of communities, and every community can set its own rule, including Sharia law, for instance.
Which is just, that was the point of what the seasteading.
Yes, absolutely. But then the only constraint that the sort of world government, but to that is the necessity that at any time, at any point in time, any individual can leave his community to join another.
Yeah.
So there is a real competition between
Yeah.
those communities on a level playing field, and that they cannot subjugate their own citizens. So under that condition, I'm happy for different societies to try different ways of organizing themselves. But within those ways of organizing themselves, I would promote society based on left libertarian principles.
Makes sense. Okay. So as long as we have to live in countries how they are defined today, it makes sense to have a basic income. But if we could create societies where people can move,
and choose freely,
and
probably, my view is that probably they would think it's the best system, and so progressively this will adjust, and countries or communities will adopt that system, and that's the natural way things should go. So not from a centrally decided pattern, but something that would evolve naturally and incrementally with a trial and error process. Right? And maybe the first experiences of basic income will be disastrous because it will be badly devised. And in that case, well, we have to move to other experiences, and I like the idea that this is a sort of spontaneous order, as Hayek would put it, that is emerging through those processes.
Yeah, and I see you have books here from Milton Friedman, and I saw a TED talk actually with Patrick Friedman, his grandson, who's actually
from the Sisteding, right?
Exactly, who's comparing just what you're saying with what's happening with startups actually. And the example it gives is apps in your phone, like you can always create a new way and people can join it
or not, right? Well, that being said, in the digital world today, you have a number of oligopolies that I think are quite dangerous and threatening, and that also, in a way, constrain individual liberty. And my particular approach to that is that, for the moment, there is no ownership rights on your own data. So your data that have been absorbed by the big platforms, they're not yours. You're not compensated for what you give to them. And in that sense, I think it's not liberal at all. And it's more an extraction of value rather than a creation of value. That's why we have argued in a report that we have published in my think tank with lawyers and economists that there should be ownership rights attached to your personal data. And so you could create a market of personal data. You could negotiate your data also through intermediaries with the different platforms. And you could be either remunerated for your data if you want to share them at market value, or you could decide to retain your data, but in order to get access to the service, then you would have to pay for it. So you would have a lot of different contractual arrangements depending on your own opinions, on your own needs, on the diversity of privacy approaches that one can espouse.
Okay, and actually, so you wrote a book about some initiatives in the world that are kind of liberal projects. Do you want to talk about some, maybe more details about one place where it actually worked really well and where it may seem counterintuitive a bit at first?
Right. So my starting point is that there is no country in the world that today really embodies those principles. So what I did is that thanks to a very rare and nice partnership with magazine Le Point in France, I was able to travel through 13 different countries and each time see a certain aspects of my sort of ideal world put into action. But not by people who would define themselves as libertarians or even liberals. It was very varied. So I went to see, for instance, the hackers in Berlin on the issue of data. The hackers in Berlin, they are hard left. I went to see people in China who would define themselves as classical liberals, and they're trying to resist the communist regime in certain ways. I went to see entrepreneurs in Rwanda who have no particular political opinion, but they are like real entrepreneurs because they have really to fight for their life by creating the tools that allow their fellow Africans to communicate. So the three I think I was most interested in is microcredit in Peru, which is how by giving people access to credit, you give them access to capitalism, and that's maybe the best way to solve poverty. Then there was direct democracy in Switzerland, like in certain cantons, in certain departments in Switzerland, all the people gather at the center of the main town once a year, and they actually decide, amend, and vote all the laws that govern the canton. And it's not something. It actually involves huge decisions for the community, and I could see how mature the people are and how maturely they behave, because that process of local democracy, as Tocqueville put it, is certainly the best pathway towards a more national democratic involvement. And then maybe the third example I have in mind, and will develop a bit more, is Finland. That's totally counterintuitive, because I wanted to go in prison. And as somebody who likes liberty, I thought, well, what about those who are deprived of liberty? And the Scandinavian countries have built a model of what they call open prisons, where the prisoners are as responsible as they can be. Meaning there is very few guards, there are no walls, no barriers. So if you want to escape, you just escape. It's in the middle of the woods, it's an estate, it's a combination of little wooden houses, and they live in groups of like roommates of 6 people, and they have the key to their room and everything. They have to be active during the day. They have to either work or study or do something with their time. And they have to respect a number of obligations, including to report where they are, what they do. But otherwise, they live a pretty normal life. And in fact, it's the very basic definition of prison, to deprive you of your liberty and only of your liberty. And paradoxically, in those types of prison, you understand better what it means to lose liberty. Because when you are in a closed prison, so when you're in your cell, what they told me is you behave like an animal, and the guards in front of you behave like animals, and you try to beat them, they try to beat you, everybody tries to cheat, and everybody behaves as an animal or an infant. Whereas in an open prison, you have to put yourself in prison each day. So you have the obligations you have to respect are actually quite strict, but you have to respect them by yourself. You're not forced to respect them. And the best example, I think, is that the limits of the estate are indicated by red sticks that are just planted in the ground. So if you want to trespass, you can. Nobody is watching you. But what the prisoners have to do each day is to make sure they don't trespass. So you reach those pickets and you have to think, well, that's it. That's my limit. And in fact, it's quite hard to think that for years and years, it's going to be as far as you can go in the world. And me, as a free man who is in prison, I could trespass. I could go further into the woods. They couldn't. And I felt there how painful it is to be deprived of liberty. But in fact, it's even better perceived in an open environment than in a closed environment. And it also corresponds to the idea that the prison, which is, I think, a liberal idea, which was first expressed by Beccaria in the 18th century, the big philosopher and jurist, that prison is not supposed to punish, but to protect society. So it's not supposed to harm people. It's supposed to deter others, also neutralize those who could be harmful to society, and try to make them better, so that when they reintegrate society, they behave better. And indeed, in the open prison system, the recidivism rate goes down, and the cost for society, even the financial cost, is lower. So you could say, well, why are those prisoners living like in very comfortable places with, probably some facilities that even the free men next door don't have. They had in this place, for instance, they had a sauna, the lake, they had a ice hockey place. And the response is, the utilitarian response is, if that produces better effects for society as a whole, then that would be a morally untenable position to try to punish them, more, just to satisfy your instinct of revenge at the detriment of your own society.
And then I'll have 2 questions. So the first one, so people can leave and they don't.
Absolutely, and funnily enough, the escape rate is lower in open prisons than closed prisons. Well, first of all, very practically speaking, they know that once they leave, they are considered as fugitives. One day or another, they'll be caught. And when they'll be caught, they'll be sent back to a closed prison. So there is this threat of the closed prison, which makes them behave better. But also there is a question of trust. And I would say it's the same for the microcredit. The essence of the microcredit is that someday, Mohamed Yunus woke up and thought, well, we won't ask collateral. We won't ask guarantee. We will trust people to pay back. And in fact, the default rate in microcredit systems is lower than in the normal sort of institutional system. And in fact, you can compare the fact that the default rate is lower in microcredit and the escape rate is lower in open prison system, because when you responsibilize people, when you trust them, well, they tend to behave better. Right? And I think it's a virtuous circle that makes everybody better. And even when you speak to the guards in an open prison, they themselves changed when they transit from an closed to an open prison system. They change their own behavior and they start seeing the prisoners as just fellow human beings. So that's a bit my conclusion, on human nature in general. Is that when you have to, and that's where I'm not a libertarian, you have to devise an incentive system which is astute enough so that people behave better, not because they are forced to, but because you have trusted them, you have empowered them in certain ways, and that makes them more intelligent.
And so, yeah, you talked about human nature. So basically, when I talk about these ideas with friends, let's say, usually the main objection is like that people can be free and responsible, and that it is all based on a pretty positive, optimistic view of human nature. So do you think that kind of proves that people can be free and responsible?
I think the idea of the enlightenment on human nature is that there is no such thing as an essence of man, but there is the idea of perfectibility of man. And I think it's still very much valuable today. And so when you think that man is perfectible, then whatever the starting point, whether he's a criminal or a poor person in Lima or a small entrepreneur in Rwanda or whatever the starting point, you can devise a system where he is incentivized to start taking his life into his own hands. But that system is pretty complicated. It's much easier for a government to just clamp down on bad behavior and try to regulate the way people live. It's easy. It's the easy option. The easy option is, for instance, to prohibit drugs. Super easy. The other option is to put in place the regulation so that drugs are legal, but at the same time you make sure that the consumers know the products they are taking.
You think if all drugs are legal, people won't tend to start getting more drugs, which is what people might think at first.
Well, if they want to take more drugs, I have nothing to say against that to start with. So is it a public policy objective that people should take less drugs? I'm not sure. But then from a more utilitarian point of view, what I saw in Colorado when they legalized marijuana is that not only the consumption rate didn't increase, but criminality went down. And in terms of public health, it's of course much better for everybody because you can report your problems you have, the addiction you have to the hospital, even to the police, because now it's legal. So you're not threatened by any criminal procedure any longer. And so, but I think it's an obvious case, right? That now most people are convinced of that. Another good example of that is just this basic income. So the social system devised on conditionality. So you get access to grant if your revenue are under a certain level, or if you put your kids to school, or if you're looking for a job, or etc., which is what most of our social systems are built on. Induces perverse effects, so that people will start cheating with the system and lying because they want access to this and that. And once they get the grant, they need to fulfill a number of obligations, and then, as usual, they will do it superficially, or they will do just enough to get the next grant. So the idea of UBI, of universal basic income, is just give them cash, no question asked, nothing asked, and they can do whatever they want with it. So in the experiences that have been conducted in India by Standing, as well as the experiences like small-scale experiences that I witnessed in Brazil, in a small village, you can see always the same thing happening, is that people who get just free cash, even if they are poorly educated, even if they are from a very underprivileged background, they act rationally. So they don't spend their money in the pub as maybe they would do in a more conditional system. And then they all have different needs. So some of them will take hairdressing courses because they have sort of entrepreneurship spirit and they want to be a hairdresser, and so they will start inventing a new business because they have this security now. But others just need to pay the bills. Others will buy classes for their kids so they can do better at school. Others will finally get the possibility to take the bus, to buy a bus ticket in order to work in the next time. So you don't know and you cannot anticipate what people really need, but what you can see is that when they get that security, all of a sudden they become more reasonable and they start projecting themselves in the future. And in Brazil, the lady who was organizing this whole scheme actually told me that people started using the future tense in their sentences. So before that, they were only speaking in the present tense. And they started projecting themselves because they had this security ahead of them.
So we're talking about some of these projects that work pretty well, and some of them are actually quite scalable because we talked about Switzerland or some projects in Finland or in India. Especially in the area of legalizing drugs or basic income, we can see there's more and more experiments. So is it, I remember last time we met, I told you about the Seasteading Institute and how you could create areas where you can experiment fast, and you were telling me it was kind of already happening a bit in a dematerialized way. So with all the experiences, how do you see it evolve?
Well, I'm non-blind, so I see the resistance of our huge welfare states, which probably in history have never been so big, and have never devised so many laws.
I think blockchain could be a really good example.
Exactly, but so I doubt that this process will really take place within our current institutions. That may be the case. I would like to see that happening because I would see that would be the proper way to do it. And indeed, in the experiments that I've seen, well, those public policies can be applied elsewhere. And for instance, in the open prison, I'm very proud that after my going there, we issued a more academic report within the think tank, and the justice minister in France just said a few weeks ago that she agreed with that approach, and that they will try to open 15 open prisons in France over the next 5 years. So there are things that you can actually do. And on the basic income front, it's hard to see it happening without an implication of the government, because it's also a tax, it's linked with the tax system. And it's not totally absurd that it could happen, especially in France, because we already have such a high level of redistribution that we in fact very well placed to implement the basic income that wouldn't change the redistribution level in the country, so that wouldn't financially disturb the level of income that people receive. There will be adjustments, but marginally. So I think we can still push into that direction of reforming the state as it is. And especially in the case of France, which I know well and where my think tank is particularly active, I don't give up. Right? But on the other hand, I can see how slow it is, how unreceptive most politicians are to those ideas. Also because they clearly deprive them of some of their power. Basic income, for instance, if you do that, well, then you have very, very, very few means of electoral corruption left, right? Because you cannot hand out grants as discriminately as you could do before.
Cryptocurrency is a big one too, because then they don't handle.
Exactly. Well, and so that's why I'm looking with curiosity and interest to all those experiences around blockchain where they decentralize levels of power without asking anybody, right? They just do it. And cryptocurrency is a good example. So yeah, I'm looking closely into that, and if maybe those projects will push the governments to move, and maybe governments will just resist that trend. And now it's quite undecided because some countries are espousing those new approaches, like Japan, where you can pay your taxes in Bitcoin. Even in France, there have been some moves by the economy minister recently to try to create a good legal environment for the blockchain to prosper. So that could happen, but if it doesn't happen, then probably people will do it by themselves in a more anarchistic fashion, and why not?
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
But how do you build prison with blockchain? There is a limit, I think, to what you can do in a self-organized way.
Yeah, no, it's true. Like for blockchain, like the internet, like this too.
Yeah, and it abolishes borders and everything. But for instance, if you think of the internet now, Facebook is sort of devising its own free speech policies of what is allowed or not on its platform in terms of pornography, terrorism, you name it. But I don't think it's proper. I don't think it's the mission of Facebook to decide what the First Amendment is about. And the First Amendment is a very powerful piece of legislation. And so I would prefer the government really enforcing the First Amendment than delegating to Facebook the mission of assessing what the level of freedom of speech we should have. Right?
Yeah, or I think maybe users will just go to a new social network that's going to be built and completely decentralized.
Yeah, but then there is a question of the data they have gathered, which makes competition very hard these days, because they have this the entry level is very high.
Yeah, that's true, but we can see movements of it could go I think it could go very fast because people are connected, and if people start to think like, and they start to think already, or we want to leave Facebook because they become too powerful, kind of. Well, there's no real alternative, but I think tomorrow if there was like an alternative, a bit like Telegram is a good alternative to WhatsApp, and an alternative like this, I think it could go really fast.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Gaspard, for coming here.
Thanks, Alex.
This interview that was really interesting. I hope people will really enjoy your ideas and this interview. Is there any work of yours that we can follow? I know you do most of your work in French, so how can we follow your ideas?
Yeah, well, so the think tank I run has an internet address, which is generationlibre.eu. So you're all welcome to go and visit. Few of our reports are available in English, especially the report on data ownership. The translation will be published in a few days now. Okay. And as far as I am concerned, I have a Twitter account, which is Gaspard Koenig, that's my name. I don't have any Facebook account for the reason we just mentioned. And I do hope that one day a few books will be translated into English.
Okay. I hope to, because they're really amazing, and maybe we'll be friends on that new social network.
Exactly, that you are creating.
Thanks, Gaspard.
Thanks.